Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Chapter 9. I have now reached the period of my life when I can give dates. I left Baltimore and went to live with Master Thomas Auld at St. Michael's in March 1832. It was now more than 7 years since I had lived with him on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. Of course, by now we were almost complete strangers to each other. I knew nothing of his temper or character, nor he of mine. In a very short time, however, we were well acquainted. I grew to know his wife as well as himself. They were a well-matched pair, being equally cruel. Now, for the first time in more than 7 years, I experienced hunger. It had been hard enough to bear when I was a child, but it was 10 times worse now, after living in Hugh Ould's house, where I had always had enough good food to eat. Even among slave owners it is considered wrong not to give a slave enough to eat. The rule is, no matter how plain the food, at least let there be enough of it. Thomas Auld did not give us enough even of the poorest food. There were 4 of us slaves in the kitchen, my sister Eliza, my Aunt Priscilla, Henny, and myself, and we were given less than half a bushel of cornmeal a week, and very little else. It was not enough to survive upon. We therefore were forced to live at the expense of our neighbors. This we did by begging and stealing, whichever was more handy. Many times we were nearly dead with hunger, when food lay spoiling in the storehouse, and yet every morning Thomas and Rowena Auld would kneel and pray that God would bless them more abundantly. Bad as all slaveholders are, most at least have one good quality. Thomas Auld was the exception. I do not know of one kind or generous act that he ever performed. He was not born a slaveholder. He had been a poor man, captain only of one small ship. He came into possession of his slaves through marriage, and of all men, newly made slaveholders were the worst. He was cruel, but cowardly. He commanded without firmness. In enforcing his rules, he was sometimes rigid and sometimes lazy. Sometimes he spoke to his slaves with the fury of a demon. At other times, he might have been mistaken for a traveler who had lost his way. He did no work himself. The luxury of having slaves was something new, and he was unprepared for it. We seldom called him master. Instead, we called him Captain Auld, when we called him anything at all. Our lack of respect for him must have puzzled him greatly. He wanted us to call him master, but lacked the dignity that would have caused us to do so. His wife tried to insist upon us calling him by that name, but with no effect. In August 1832, Thomas Auld attended a Methodist camp meeting, and there he got religion. I briefly hoped that his conversion would lead him to free his slaves, or at least make him more kind and humane. I was disappointed on both scores. If it had any effect on his character, it made him more cruel and hateful than ever. Before his conversion, he relied upon his own cruelty, but after it, he found religious grounds to support his behavior. He made a great show of being a pious man. His house was the house of prayer, and he prayed morning, noon, and night. He soon became well known among his neighbors as a powerful man of God. His house was the preacher's favorite. They used to take great pleasure in visiting him, for while he starved us, he stuffed them. We often had 3 or 4 preachers staying there at one time. While I lived with my master in St. Michael's, there was a young white man, a Mr. Wilson, who offered to start a Sunday school for the instruction of slaves who might wish to learn to read the New Testament. We met only 3 times, when white neighbors of Thomas Auld burst in upon us with sticks and other weapons, drove us off, and forbade us to meet again, and so ended our little Sunday school in the godly town of St. Michael's. Thomas Auld found excuses for his cruelty in religion. As an example, I will tell you that I have seen him tie up a lame young woman, Henny, and whip her upon her naked shoulders, causing the warm red blood to drip. To justify his bloody deed, he quoted this passage of Scripture: "He that knoweth the master's will, and doeth it not, shall be beaten with many stripes." I have known him to tie her up early in the morning and whip her before breakfast, leave her, go to his store, return at dinner, and whip her again, cutting her in the places he had already made raw with his whip. The secret of his cruelty toward Henny lay in the fact that she was almost helpless. When she was a child, she fell into the fire and burned herself horribly. Her hands were so injured that they were useless. She could do little besides carry heavy loads. She was an expense to Thomas Auld, and because he was a stingy man, this greatly offended him. He once gave her away to his sister, but, as she was a poor gift, the sister soon returned her. Finally he, in his own words, set her adrift to care for herself. Here was this new Christian, holding on to the mother and turning out her helpless child to starve and die. Thomas Old and I disagreed in many ways. He found me unsuitable for his purpose. My city life, he said, had ruined me. One of my greatest faults was that I let his horse run away and go down to his father-in-law's farm about 5 miles away. I would then have to go after it. My reason for this carelessness was that I could always get something to eat when I was there. Master William Hamilton, my master's father-in-law, always gave his slaves enough to eat. I never left there hungry. Thomas Old finally said that he would stand my behavior no longer. I had lived with him for 9 months, during which he had whipped me often. And so, he said he would put me out to be broken. And for this purpose, he hired me out for 1 year to a man named Edward Covey. Covey was a poor man who rented the land he worked, and as well as the slaves with which he worked it. Covey had a very high reputation for breaking young slaves, and this reputation was of great value to him. It allowed him to get his farm worked cheaply. Slaveholders were willing to lend their slaves to Covey for the sake of the training which they would receive. Covey was a pious man, a member and leader in the Methodist Church. This added weight to his reputation as a breaker. I knew all this, having been told of it by a young man who had lived there. Still, I made the change gladly, for I was sure of getting enough to eat, which is not the smallest consideration to a hungry man.